All right, let's have a look at some more questions that I received. And the first two questions I have received, pardon me, are about Visconti. Are Visconti steel nibs as good as their gold nibs? Is the nib material an important factor? Visconti has three kinds of nibs: steel, palladium, gold. As I understand it, palladium is more or less discontinued. I'm trying to be brief here. There may or may not have been some issues with the palladium nibs. If you had a good palladium nib, it was stellar and outstanding. If you had a bad palladium nib, it could barely write. And you could find anything in between those two extremes. Palladium is now no longer, I think, really used. So they have moved back to gold. They already had gold. They had 14 and 18K gold. And now they have gold nibs again. I think in many ways that was a wise decision because, again, some of the palladium nibs were honestly outstanding. Some had a lot of issues. So phasing them out, replacing them by gold, which you know used to work, I think is a wise choice. Now, I've tried one and only one of the gold nibs, the new gold nibs, and I think it is very pleasant. It was a much more pleasant experience than some of the palladium nibs have given me. But that was not really the question. The question was steel versus gold. Well, does nib material matter? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. But there's a reason there are differences in nib materials. Gold is more expensive. Gold is also typically a little bit softer than stainless steel alloys are. Does that matter? Yes, because that means that when you write, you may experience a little bit of bounce in the nib tines as you write with them. That doesn't mean that every gold nib is a flex nib, because most gold nibs are absolutely not flex nibs, but that's a slightly different discussion. So, are the steel nibs as good? In many ways, I have found the Visconti steel nibs to be excellent because, as far as I remember, the Visconti steel nibs wrote every single time out of the box. So, in many ways, I found those nibs to be more reliable than the palladium nibs, and also some of the gold nibs, because I have had some issues with Visconti gold nibs. Most of the especially older 18K gold nibs I found very pleasant, but occasionally I had an issue there too. Whereas the steel, again, in my recollection, wrote well and out of the box every single time. Sip of tea. So, I hope this two-part question has been answered in a somewhat concise manner. Yes, in the shortest fashion, I think the steel nibs are good. And second part, yes, nib material absolutely matters. But as I've said many times before, don't forget that it is very hard tipping that hits the page, and that is likely the same on steel and gold and palladium and whatever else you have. So from that perspective, it doesn't really matter. But it's the softness of the gold that gives you a slightly different writing experience, because the nib gives a little bit as you write, which kind of cushions your writing. I find that typically a bit more pleasant than a gold nib. But that's just me. Second question. And this one is a bit philosophical, so I'll try to keep this brief. Are Visconti pens style over function? In many ways, I think yes, but it depends on the model. Visconti has many models. I think some of their super fancy pens, I for example think of the Alchemist, which is a double-ended pen that comes in a magnetic stand that's a big circle on a it's not a pyramid because it's round. What is that? A cone, like whatever. I forget what you call that. Sorry, but you click the pen in, and it's. I actually think it's quite attractive. It's not for everyone, but that is, I would say, absolutely style. They really go for style, but it's an Italian brand. They care about the designs they put out. Some of the pens I think are very functional. The Van Gogh pens, I don't find the most spectacularly designed pens. They're also in a lower price segment than their super fancy pens are. But having said that, I think it depends on the model. Pardon me. Some of the Visconti models are indeed, I don't want to say 100% style, but I think those are really made to put in a glass cabinet or put on a desk just to show people that you have an interesting pen, not necessarily made to really use. But you can say this about a number of brands. Some of the super fancy Mont Blanc limited editions or collector's editions, I also think, are they're to be collected, not necessarily to be used. They can be uncomfortable, just like Visconti, just like any other brand in that segment of the pen world. Having said that, some of the pens I own are Viscontis that I really like using, and they are absolutely user pens. They can be used. They're not just there to be put on a desk. Okay, we have a question here that I have partially answered in the past, but again, I'll try to be brief. Is there a difference in performance between a number 6, number 7, number 8 nib? I want to devote a video to this because I keep getting questions like these. I have not felt that a number 8 nib is wetter than a number 6 nib, or a number 7 nib. I don't believe that. I haven't felt this. Now, having said that, there are some mitigating factors. For example, a Bock number 8 nib, that is their 380 nib unit, as far as I know, always has an ebonite feed. I don't think I've ever seen them with a plastic feed. Ebonite has better ink flow characteristics than plastic. So from that perspective, you could say a number 8 nib has better ink flow than a number 6 nib by the same brand, because one has a plastic feed, one has an ebonite feed. But having said that, it's not necessarily the case that number 8 nibs are always, say, broader. They come in extra fine, fine, medium, broad, double broad, just like I thought it was a double broad, and I thought there was an extra fine. Anyway, they come in the same nib grades, at the very least fine, medium, broad, as a number 6 nib does. And I haven't found that just because the number 8 nib is bigger, it's also broader than, say, a number 6 broad nib. I haven't experienced that. And just for the record, because sometimes people who especially are new to fountain pens are kind of mystified by where these numbers come from. It's really quite simple. If you take the nib out of a pen, which you can't do with every pen, but follow along with the steps, and you measure the diameter of the feed, right, then that's a certain number of millimeters, and that is 5, 6, 7, 8. And that's where those numbers come from. So a number 8 nib has a feed with an 8 millimeter diameter. That's all. All right. The final question I have is someone who wrote me an email, and I will expurgate it a little bit, but it came down to, I am new to pens and nobody really pays attention to this, and I don't understand. How do you know if an ink is wet or dry? Because I am confused and I don't know where to find this information. Understandable. So, wet inks and dry inks. How do you do it? Pay attention. You take a sample vial. You put in the ink. Yeah. You look at it. Yeah. Looks like ink. Pretty wet. Done. Look, I don't think there's an answer to this. Okay? I really hope that was clean. No, I cleaned it. It was whiskey. No, I don't drink. It was Coke Zero. Look, I don't think you know. I don't think you know. This is an empirical question, right? How do you know what the weather is going to be? I don't know. You need to take a lot of factors into account, and then you make calculations and you create a model, and then you know. Inks have different properties. They have different chemicals in them. I have not run a full chemical analysis on this, but I assume that specific dyes, just because of the way they're put together in the ink, make for a drier writing experience than others. And that can be odd. For example, in my experience, Waterman blue, washable blue, is pretty wet, but Lamy washable blue is pretty dry. Ackerman Delft Blauw is a washable blue, it's pretty dry. Why is the Waterman wetter? I don't know. Must be something in the components that are used for that ink, right? So unfortunately, You can forget about reading the label on the bottle. It's not going to be there. You can forget about a doctor's prescription because you don't get it for ink. There's not going to be a little information manual in your ink that says this ink is 75% wet. I mean, at the end of the day, and this is not, I'm not trying to make a joke out of this, but I mean, obviously every ink is wet because it's liquid, right? But I mean, the writing experience will be a little bit different. And as I just said, try Lamy Blue. I find it fairly dry. Try Waterman Blue, the regular Serenity Blue. I find it wetter. Those are pretty affordable inks. So you can get a bottle of each or a sample of each from shops that sell samples. Try it and experience for yourself. At the end of the day, that's what it is. Can I give other examples? Yes, G. Herbin Lit de Thé is a dry ink. I think the consensus is that is a dry ink. Okay? But then the Iro Shizuku inks, which actually are lubricated inks, those are all pretty wet. Especially if I think of something like Konpeki, that's a very wet ink. The point I'm trying to make is there is no objective standard. So what is wet to me may actually be dry to someone if that person always uses incredibly wet inks, for example, lubricated inks. That's the first aspect of this. It's a subjective experience, and I think again there is some consensus. I think I don't ever heard anyone say, "Oh, Lit de Thé, that's the wettest ink I've ever used." So, right, there is some consensus, but there is absolutely a subjective factor. Then it also depends on the pen you use. I once had a discussion with someone who said, "Yeah, everybody is raving about your ink, and I don't know, it's very dry, and I don't see any shading. It's supposed to shade." And I said, what nibs do you use? He said, "I only use Japanese extra fine." Okay, if you only use Japanese extra fine nibs, right, you get a very thin line on the page. So I don't think anything is going to be particularly wet. I don't think anything is really going to shade. That's fine. I'm just saying that also influences the wetness and dryness of an ink. The pen matters, the nib matters, the feed matters, the paper you use matters. If you use copier paper, pretty much every ink is going to be dry because the ink gets sucked into the paper fibers. If you use a coated paper like, say, Rhodia, you'll see a lot more wetness and it'll be a wetter experience. And the final point, I think, is this is an empirical question. This is not a matter where you can look it up, because I don't believe, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't believe anyone has compiled for every ink in the world, this is the wetness factor. First of all, again, I think it's fairly subjective, but beyond that, I don't think that compendium exists. See what I did there? Anyway. So it's empirical. You have to do it. You have to go out and experience the inks. Does that mean you have to buy all these inks? Maybe. Maybe someone can give you a sample. Maybe you can try it out and dip it in a store. Maybe you can, whatever. But at the end of the day, you have to figure out. It's up to you. There is no objective standard for this, and there is no place where you can look up all this information, as far as I know. Now, what if you say, "Yeah, but this is all too much"? Okay, then go to a forum. Go to the Fountain Pen Network and say, "Hello, I am about to purchase Noodler's Democrat's Coffin Brown. Could you please tell me if this is a wet or a dry ink? Because I tend to prefer whatever. What is your experience with this ink?" And I guarantee you that at least 5 to 10 people are going to chime in and going to say, "Oh, I have that ink. I don't like it. It's too dry for me," or "I love it. It's very wet," or whatever. And you'll get an idea, right? Beyond that, you can do whatever the hell you want to do. So, I hope that was useful. Again, I did really try to break that final question down. But I would like to make one more quick remark. This is not a dig at the person who asked the question, because I think this was a very fair question to ask, especially if you are indeed starting out using fountain pens, you just don't know this. But that's why I said the final thing I said. You can do whatever the hell you want to do. Sometimes I feel that people get a little worried about, "Oh, I should be using wet inks only," or "Oh, I should only be using, because that's sometimes the impression that you get online, sometimes from forums or fountain pen videos. But at the end of the day, you have chosen to use fountain pens and ink, right? Probably, I'm assuming, bottled ink, given the question. Do that, but do those things that make you happy. As long as nobody else gets hurt, it's okay. And you can do that. And you can use a wetter ink. And if it turns out that you just love dry inks because that's convenient to you because they dry faster on the page, then use dry inks, right? You are free to do those things and make those choices for yourself on your own, and it's okay. Don't let anyone tell you what to do, and don't let yourself be maneuvered into thinking, well, now I should be doing X, Y, or Z because that's what the community suggests I should be doing. Make your own choices. That was just a general statement. I shall now end. I hope this was useful. I'm glad to hear that it was. I will gladly see you later. Bye-bye.